Turn that thing on, it'll work better. Good morning. Turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3 is where we're picking up this morning. We're continuing our study of the book of Daniel. We are in the middle of the chapter regarding Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jewish names Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. Nebuchadnezzar had constructed an image. Some think it was an image of himself. He had commanded that all people in his kingdom, when certain music played, they were to bow down and to worship that idol. Everything seemed to go as planned until Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. Some of those wise men and astrologers and advisors of King Nebuchadnezzar who were working with maybe even under Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego turned them in and told them they're not doing what you told them to do. And Nebuchadnezzar brought them in. I mentioned last week, at least he gave them a chance to answer for themselves. He didn't punish them based on somebody else to say so. He brought them in. He said, I'll give you a chance to worship my image. And that's where we quit. We're picking up with verse 16 this morning. And I mentioned the fact last Sunday morning that I think it's really interesting to me and says something about their character, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's answer. We'll look at what it says and we'll have a couple comments to make. He says, verse 16, they answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. When it says we have no need to answer you, the meaning there is we know what our answer is going to be. This is not some hard question to answer. We've decided what the answer is going to be. It doesn't take any length of time. And then they say, God can deliver us if God chooses to do so. He has that power. Then they make what is to me the most interesting statement. Verse 18, but if not. In other words, if God doesn't save us, if God doesn't deliver us from this fiery furnace, we still will not worship your idol. What they're saying is my faithfulness to God is not dependent upon circumstances. I'm going to be faithful to God. I'm going to serve God no matter what else happens. Now, I think sometimes we view this from our viewpoint. We're after all the end of it. And we go into the story thinking, well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be delivered. That's the way we read the story. That's not the way it happened. They didn't know that. They did not know that God was going to save them from that fiery furnace. They did not know they were going to walk out of there okay. They did not know how God was going to respond to this. And that happens to us quite often. We face temptations and trials and troubles, and we don't know how God's going to respond. We know God's going to do what's best. We know God's going to take care of us, but how He's going to take care of us is a different issue. And I've talked about the fact before, sometimes God delivers us from the storm. Sometimes God delivers us through the storm. And we have to be prepared for that. We have to understand going into these situations that not every time is God going to save us from those things. Sometimes we're going to have to live through them. The best example of that is Christ. Did God have the power to save Jesus from the cross? Yes, unequivocally yes. Did God do that? No. Did God fail Jesus? No. Because what His answer is always what's best. And Jesus' response was much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went to the Garden of Eden. He said, God, take this cup away from me, but not as I will, but as thou wilt. And so we have to make the determination before we ever enter. If I go into a situation with the idea that maybe I'll be faithful and maybe I won't, 95% of the time, I'm not going to. Because the pressure is going to be too great. Just a minute. But if I make a determination, if my faith is solid and my commitment to God is solid, and I go into it with the idea, I'm going to be faithful to God no matter what happens. That's the kind of attitude we need to have.
Many years ago, a man by the name of Ted Turner, his sister was dying, and he said, if God save her, or I won't believe in you anymore. His faith was situational.
Well, I'm not sure he had faith to begin with, but that's another issue. We cannot base our faith on outcome. Our faith is based on who God is.
You may discuss this last week, I remember, as soon as this golden image went up, don't you think they were expecting this?
Yeah.
This was going to happen.
Yeah.
It was just a matter of when. So they made their decision at that point. Here's what we're going to do, and we're not going to waver. We're going to serve God no matter what.
I would think they probably, as far as that specific issue is concerned, I think they made the decision to serve God a long time before that.
What about fear? Do you think there was fear on their part?
Oh, yeah. If you're not afraid of a fiery furnace, something's wrong with you. I think sometimes we get the wrong idea. And I first read it this way. Now, many of you may remember the fact I've talked about. My brother's wife died of breast cancer in 1990. Her oldest son was 17, 18 years old at the time. The next spring, one of his requirements in one of his classes in school, they had to write an essay about courage and the best example of courage they knew of. And he wrote about his mother and the things that she faced in going through cancer. I still got the essay in the file in my office. And one of the statements he made, and he quoted it from somebody, but I don't remember who he quoted it from. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to overcome fear. I've got a thing in a plaque somewhere, I'm not sure where it's at. It's attributed to John Wayne. Whether it was John Wayne or whether his character, I don't know. But it says, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. So if you think that courage means you're never afraid, you're never going to have any courage because you're always going to have fear.
Build on they didn't know the outcome. They were still tossed in the furnace.
Yeah.
I mean, an angel delivered them. But I think those boys knew that, hey, this is hot.
Yeah. I don't think there's any question they did. God protected them, but there was a possibility, and they had this possibility in mind because it said so. There's a possibility God's not going to do that. We don't know what's going to happen to us. But no matter what happens, we will not worship your idol.
You mentioned Christ going to the cross. You think he experienced fear?
On the human side, yes. If you're driving nails driven through your hands and your feet, there's got to be some fear there. Now you can control that fear. You can work instead of that fear. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear is an emotion. It's what we do with that fear that makes a difference. Sometimes fear is a good thing because it keeps you from doing things that might be stupid. You know, fear keeps you from jumping off a 150-foot building. I'm afraid I might die. Well, possibility is, in fact, probability is you would. God instilled this idea of fear within us. But just like any other emotion, we have to be in control of the emotion instead of the emotion being in control of us. And oftentimes when people will scream and holler and yell or they'll react to some situation, I just couldn't keep myself. Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. God gave you that ability. You just chose not to. You chose to let the emotion overwhelm you instead of you using that emotion to better yourself and to better the situation that you're in. I have no doubt Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had some fear. They controlled it. They let their faith overtake their fear. And I think that's what the Bible says when it talks about faith overcoming fear. Perfect love casting out fear. It controls fear. Fear is never completely gone. I don't think it is. If you are honest with yourself and you read what Scripture says about hell, I've been a member of the church over 45 years, over 50 years. I'm still afraid of hell. If you're not, something's wrong with you. The fact of the matter is, if I'm a faithful child of God, I'm not going there. I don't have a great deal to worry about, but there's still that at least that tiny part, I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to have to face this. And so I don't think to be faithful to God doesn't mean you never have fear. One of the ways you overcome it is by admitting it and then dealing with it. Face to face. It's not the same, but in a way it's similar. Somebody asked me one time when I get up and preach if I still get nervous, if I still get... And I made this statement, and I firmly believe it, and I will live by it. The day I stop getting nervous in the pulpit, I will quit preaching. Because it's that nervousness, it's that edge that keeps me sharp. And the moment I get to the point that I don't feel that, I'm done. Now, it's not what it used to be. The first time I ever preached a sermon, you would have thought a shotgun was going on. Because my knees were knocking like crazy. When Greta and I first got married and I got ready to preach, the very first thing I did was empty my pockets and give everything I had to Greta. Because if I didn't, my hands would have been rattling keys and chains and knives and whatever was in my pocket I'd been doing this with. I don't do that anymore. But there's still a hint of nervousness and maybe even a little bit of anxiety because you don't want to say the wrong thing. Well, there's always, I think, maybe in the background, but there's always a little bit of fear. Now, the one thing I didn't want to mention, I think it's on the screen up there, that last phrase under verse 16 through 18, they had the choice. They could fear the king, who was Nebuchadnezzar, or they could fear the king, who's God. Now, who are you more afraid of? Which one has greater consequences? Submit to Nebuchadnezzar or submit to God? Fear not he who can destroy the body, but fear he who can destroy both body and soul in hell. I have a greater God than you. I have a greater responsibility than you. Now, I'm talking about the children of Israel, them talking to Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not talking about I have a greater responsibility than you. And so they did that. They said, we're not going to do this. We're just not. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. You know, when you read much about Nebuchadnezzar, you get the idea that he was a very ruthless and oftentimes angry. Every time he turns around, it seems like he's mad at somebody. He was filled with fury. The expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah, have you ever seen somebody who was so mad you said you can just see it in their face? That's what it's talking about with Abednego. He's so mad you can see it in his face. His visage, its expression changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And what that phrase very simply meant, it was heated as hot as it could be heated. As far as we're able to ascertain, there were not thermometers in that day and age, so they couldn't have said it was 150, so now it's going to be whatever 7 times 150 was. 1,050, I think that's right. But they made it as hot as they could possibly make it. Now this furnace would have been what shaped kind of like an oversized Coke bottle with a very, very large bottom that had a door in the side of the bottom which you opened to put the fuel in, whether it was charcoal or wood or whatever it was you were setting on fire. It then came up and kind of narrowed up to the top where there was a large hole at the top, and that's where it was used for making brick or melting metal or refining metal. That's what those furnaces were used for. And that's where the ore was dropped in. That's where the metal or whatever it was they were trying to purify was dropped in at the top. And so you had this large thing, and it was not built specifically for this purpose. It already existed, because they did a lot of work with brick, they did a lot of work with metal, they did a lot of work with that kind of stuff, and they needed these furnaces. In fact, there may have been several in Babylon, we don't know. But that's what this furnace was. And Nebuchadnezzar was enraged, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the fiery furnace. He took several of his best soldiers. Now, the purpose of this is very simple. It's to keep Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from fighting back. Now, they had no intention of doing that, but Nebuchadnezzar didn't know that. So he had some of his best army soldiers take them. They were bound in their cloaks, in their tunics. In other words, they were completely clothed. They were tied up, completely clothed. They were taken to the top of that furnace, and they were thrown in from the top. Now, the idea is, because they had, what's the first thing that's going to catch fire? Their clothes. The idea was to throw them in from the top. Before they hit the ground, they're going to be dead. They're going to be incinerated, because the heat's going to get them on the way down. Once their clothes start burning, they're done for. And so they put them in, and they drop them in, and evidently there was a place at the bottom where Nebuchadnezzar could see. He's watching. They were thrown into the fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. Can you imagine? It's so hot. The people walk up to the top of the furnace to drop them in, and they're dead. They're burned up. That gives you some kind of an idea of what kind of fire Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being tossed into. This is not some campfire. This isn't some fireplace. This is a furnace that was probably at the least several hundred degrees, maybe even thousands. As hot as they could possibly get. They fell bound into the fiery furnace. The Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4, unbound, walking around in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar is amazed, because he put 3 people in there, tied up, bound up, into a furnace that is several hundred degrees hot. And when he looks in, there's not 3 people, there's 4. And they're not tied up anymore, they're walking around. Can you imagine walking around in the middle of that furnace? As hot as that was? That's what they're doing. Now, for a long time, I had people tell me, I think the King James Version says that the 4th is like a son of God. And there are a lot of commentators who look at that and say that's Jesus. That's not what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. Nebuchadnezzar did not even know that a person such as Jesus existed. He knew about Jehovah because he had dealt with him. What he's saying is the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. If you remember, if you ever studied paganism and heathen gods had wives. They had children. They had families. And so he's talking about this 4th person looks like a son of the gods. In other words, he looks different. He looks divine. He looks like deity. Now, how he knew what deity looked like, I have no idea. I'm probably, my guess would be he looks different than humans. He doesn't look like a human being. My suggestion would be that's probably an angel. Now, it is a possibility, don't deny it is a possibility that it was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. That's a possibility. I don't think it was. That's my opinion. I don't think there's any way of knowing for certain. Nebuchadnezzar came, and the first thing he said when he saw those four, notice what he said. He went to his council, and didn't we throw in three? Didn't we put three people in there? Am I seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing? Yeah, we put in three. So now there's four. Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together, saw the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Imagine that. Now come, I think it's first week in November, we're going to have a big bonfire out at Nathan and Jennifer's house. We usually go out there and stay 2 or 3 hours. You know what I smell like when I come home? Smell like smoke. You've been around that bonfire. There is a smell that comes from being around fire. They want their eyebrows. I remember when we lived in Enterprise, I was grilling on the charcoal grill and the fire went out. And I went to restart that fire and I got too close and I sprayed lighter fluid on it. My eyebrows were gone. They were singed. The fire didn't hurt them. The cloaks were not, their clothes weren't burned. Wasn't any ashes on them. Wasn't any sign of any fire on them. And no smell of fire had come upon them. That's amazing. It's not enough that God protected them from the fire and God saved them alive. God protected them from the smell of the smoke. You couldn't even tell they'd been in a furnace. God's deliverance is always complete.
Is this a type, the story of a type of salvation?
Yeah, I think so. I think it could be. Of course, the whole import of there are two major lessons we get from chapter 3. One of them is the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and what you can do if your faith is what it ought to be. I think the second lesson that's taught by this chapter is the sovereignty of God. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was in control. He found out he wasn't. There's going to be several times in this chapter and the next chapter as well where Nebuchadnezzar is going to be running. You don't run this place. I do. And that's a lesson you and I need to remember today. We don't run this country. God does. The world doesn't run this nation, this world. God does. It's still His kingdom. It's still His world. He's still in control, and He hadn't abdicated. Now, He does give us free will. We are allowed to make certain decisions. Making those decisions means we have to be willing to accept the consequences. Have to be willing to live with what happens as a result of the decisions that we make. But God's will is going to be fulfilled. Either we're going to help Him, or He's going to do it in spite of us. One or the other. This is my Father's world. Always has been, and always will be. Nebuchadnezzar, verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel, and delivered His servants who trusted in Him, and set aside the king's commandment, and yielded up their bodies, rather than serve and worship any God except their own God. Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. He's impressed with two things. He's impressed with the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who made the decision, we will die before we will worship another god. Now, to the pagans, that was highly unusual. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had a god. Nebuchadnezzar's god was Marduk. And that's who he worshipped. But Nebuchadnezzar did not have any problem with accepting another god. In fact, he didn't have a problem with accepting 1,000 other gods. In fact, most of them did. Pagans were polytheistic. They believed in all kinds of gods. Now, in most of those systems, there was what they referred to as a chief god. That is, he was in charge of all the other gods. But the Babylonians didn't have a problem with the fact that the Greek gods existed, or the Roman gods existed, or that Jehovah existed. They didn't have a problem believing God existed. Their problem was, and they didn't believe in just one God. It's very interesting. You read first century history. You know what the Romans and the Greeks referred to Christians as? Atheists. Isn't that amazing? Children of God were referred to as atheists because they didn't believe in the plurality of gods. So Nebuchadnezzar's issue is not accepting the existence of Jehovah. Nebuchadnezzar's problem is accepting that God is the only God. There's just one. When he thought there were probably thousands. But they made that decision. We are not going to cross. We're not going to disobey Jehovah. He was impressed by that. Second thing he was impressed by was the power of God. You remember back when all of this started and Nebuchadnezzar talked about the fact that those who did not worship are going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. Then whose God will be able to deliver them? Well, God answered that question, didn't he? Nebuchadnezzar at that point thought he was greater than the gods. I've done this. Now nobody can stop it. And Jehovah said, wait a minute. I can stop it. And he did. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Now, what Nebuchadnezzar says here is you cannot blaspheme the God, notice how he phrases this, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He did not say the God. He did not say my God. He did not say universal God, supreme God. He said their God. You can't blaspheme their God. So Nebuchadnezzar at this point, just like he was in chapter 2, is admitting that Jehovah exists. There is a God named Jehovah, or Elohim, or whichever name you want to use. But he is not yet to the point of believing in God as being the universal God. Because he compares God to the pagans. There's no God, no other God who can deliver like this one, which means there are other gods. He's still polytheistic. He's still pagan. He has just brought God into his pagan realm. He's made him a god just like Marduk and Baal and Ashtaroth and Ra and all these other gods, all these other nations worshipped and believed in. Well, he's not yet been converted yet. He's beginning to understand a little bit about the power of God, but hadn't drawn him fully there yet. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now, there is some question that says he promoted them. Whether they were given greater power than they had before, or whether they was returned to their original position. Remember back at the end of chapter 2, because of Daniel, they had been made rulers in the province of Babylon. They may have, when They refused to worship the golden image, and Nebuchadnezzar decided to throw them in the fiery furnace. No doubt their position was taken away from them. They were not rulers in Babylon anymore. When it says they promoted them, they may have been put back in that position they had before, or they may have been given greater responsibility. We just don't know which. Now, if you, like I, have been attending, started attending Bible class when you were a young kid, you've heard this story probably thousands and maybe even thousands of times. But every time I read it, it strengthens my faith in God. And it also strengthens my understanding of the sovereignty of God. And it tells me Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not superhumans. They didn't have special powers that you and I don't have. Faith can win. We can be victorious over the world if we grab a hold of that faith and we don't let it go. I don't know. And that's the question. She asked, did I think if I was ever put in that kind of position, would I have about that much faith? And my answer was, I don't know. I don't think you really know till you get there. I've never been put in that position before. Yeah. If we will hold fast to Him and hold fast to our faith, we can get through anything. By we, I mean us and God. Because what we can't handle, He can. But the issue is, God is not going to force me to do something that I don't want to do. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said, we don't want to be cast into that fiery furnace, we're going to worship that God, God would have let them. Because that's the choice they made. Now, there may have been consequences to that. I don't know that because it didn't happen that way. But God doesn't force us to be His children. God doesn't force us to be obedient. God doesn't force us to be faithful. That's our choice. But when we make that choice, then we have to live by it. I want to ask you this simple question. What do you think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's faith was like after the fiery furnace? Don't you imagine that strength? Look at what my God can do. They had that faith beforehand, but now they'd actually seen it. It actually happened. It's Nebuchadnezzar was convinced of some things, just not convinced of everything like we want him to be. But this was an amazing event. And we don't need to, because we're so familiar with it and we've heard it so many times, we've read it so many times, we don't need to downplay it. We don't need to underemphasize the greatness and the vastness of what happened here.
Roger, we have a distinct advantage over them.
Yeah.
We have Christ and grace, and we understand exactly how it's going to be okay later. I don't think they did. They just didn't want to dishonor God. They had that much respect for God that they didn't want to dishonor Him. I don't know that they had an eternal mindset at that point.
I don't know whether they had, how much they knew, but there are some indications in the Old Testament that people did have some faith in the afterlife. Now, what that afterlife involved, I don't know. You remember Job asked the question, if a man dies, shall he live again? And later on he said, I know that I shall see my Redeemer. And so there was some faith. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11, in talking about those great men of God, it said they looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. They knew something about heaven. I don't think they knew as much as we do. And I don't think they knew the exact way to get there because Christ hadn't died yet. Everything about, and we've talked about this some more, everything about the old covenant was intended to kind of shroud or darken or make a mystery the way of getting to God. The veil, the fact that only certain people could enter the temple, only certain people could enter the most holy place. The fact that there was an offering and then there was a scapegoat. The fact that there were offerings made every day, on special days. A Day of Atonement, then there was a scapegoat. All those things were intended to show that the way to heaven was not quite yet clear. In fact, I think in that same passage in Hebrews, it talks about the fact there were things that they diligently searched into. They wanted to know what the answer was, but they didn't have it. We do. We see the full picture. We see the whole thing. We see the plan of God laid out all the way from Genesis to Revelation. We got a great advantage that they didn't have. Yes.
While they were in the furnace, when Nebuchadnezzar saw that there was a sweat process in the fire, but while they were in the fire, I wonder what they were talking about.
I have no way of knowing. I'm not even going to make a suggestion.
Well, there was an angel in there.
I will make a suggestion. I think they were talking about God, but that's... Huh?
There might have been an angel in it, and not what they were talking about.
Just an observation about Nebuchadnezzar. He was so full of himself that he set up this huge statue and wanted people to bow down and worship that statue. He wanted to set himself up as a god.
Yeah.
And at the end of it all, he got grounded and humbled.
Hey.
Full of fury, and then he's just like, what?
One of the things they did that unfortunately our society seems to be getting back to, their whole religion was based on the fact that the gods were supposed to serve them. The gods were supposed to take care of them. The gods were supposed to provide for them. The gods were supposed to do whatever they wanted them to do. And Nebuchadnezzar thought he had the right to order the gods around. That's not the way this thing works. God doesn't work for me. God is not at my control and my whim. I work for God. But time and time and time and time again, I've heard people talk about the fact that God didn't do this, or God didn't do this, or if God doesn't do this, I'm not going to worship him anymore. David mentioned a few moments ago Ted Turner, who became an atheist when he was 10 years old because his sister died of cancer. God didn't do what I wanted him to do, so I'm going to stop believing in John. That sounds like Santa Claus. God is not Santa Claus. God is not your doting old grandfather who gives you everything that you want. God is the supreme ruler of the universe, and I submit to him. He doesn't submit to me. Whether I agree with anything he says or does or not doesn't amount to hill beans. It doesn't matter. Now, does that mean God will never give me? No. Because God has promised to take care of me. He's promised to grant my requests in accordance with his will. I think we've talked about this several times. A very good correlation between God and his people are parents and children. I mentioned several times when I was a kid growing up, my mother had a favorite saying that ended all discussion. You tell a 4-year-old to do something, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get about 15 whys. Why? My mother ended the discussion with 4 words. Because I said so. End of discussion. Now, does that mean my mother hated me? My mother never gave me anything I wanted? My mother never wanted me happy? No. It meant that she knew who was in charge. And it wasn't me. Although I like to think it was me. God loves you. God wants what's best for you. God wants to bless you. He wants you to be happy. He wants you to live a full life. But He also wants you to understand, because I said so. I'm God, and this is my world, and you will submit to me, or you will pay the price. Now, He doesn't do that out of anger and out of domination, out of the fact I'm going to prove that I'm right and prove that you're wrong. He does it because it's what's best for us. Every parent that I know of, worth their salt, are making decisions for their children based on what they think is best for their children. God makes decisions based on what He knows is best for us. And that's one of the differences. Parents make mistakes because they're humans. God doesn't make mistakes. God always does what's right. And as sovereign ruler, that's His prerogative. And the idea that man gets to reject what God has said is horrible and has horrible consequences. There's not a week go by, I'll hear somebody on television talking about the fact that God may have said this, but I think, or God may have said this, but that's wrong, or God may have said this, but we live in a modern world. That's just too old-fashioned. That's too old fuddy-duddy. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. When I was in college in Montgomery, Alabama Christian College, a man by the name of Jack Evans, founder of Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, Texas, came and spoke in chapel one day, and that's how he closed his chapel speech. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. When he finished, a friend of mine and I were talking, and I said, in reality, the second of those statements is unneeded. God said it. That settles it. Doesn't matter whether I believe it or not. Doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. Doesn't matter whether the world believes it or not. God said it. That settles it. That's the end of the matter. Question or comment? Anyone? We will pick up with chapter 4 next Sunday morning.